So we looked at option 1, standard networking, and we've looked at option 2, where we've got slightly different networking. We've got multiple EPGs, multiple groups of servers on the same subnet. So let's take this one step further and think about how customers really start to drive the benefits from ACI. So again, I always draw up my VRF and my subnet, and I'll have my EPG just here. As I mentioned before, that the EPG is where my servers are attaching to on the network. I look at the incoming switch, interface and VLAN, and that's how we identify the servers that sit in that group. And by default, within this group, all of these servers can talk to each other. They sit on the same VLAN, they're allowed to communicate. Now, optionally, I can enforce isolation, so I can stop east-west traffic through here. So the servers are no longer able to talk to each other within this EPG. So customers very often use this in their web farm environments, whereby they want to take a group of web servers and say, well, web server 1 should never talk to web server 2, even though it's on the same VLAN, it's in the same subnet. So in this case, we just turn on the isolation and we actually prevent those servers talking to each other. So that's an isolated EPG. Something else that always comes up with customers, especially in competitive situations, is microsegmentation. And it's something that I always try to get customers to really define what they mean by microsegmentation. So let me give you an example. We've got a subnet, and I've got a group of servers, my EPG, attached to this group of servers. And I'm operating quite normally. I might set this to enforced or unenforced, but here are my servers attached on the network. So a form of microsegmentation could be simply to build excuse me, another EPG on the subnet. So here's my second group of servers, and they can't communicate. I've got no contract in place, therefore I've got no communication to allow them to talk. So this is what I always class as microseg in IP, because I've taken a subnet that I've got today, and now I've deployed different groups of servers securely onto this subnet. So this really is your first and most basic form of microsegmentation. The next form of microsegmentation is to look at an attribute of a machine. So now I've got my servers, my virtual machines attached to the network. In a virtual machine estate, I might want to look at an attribute of this virtual machine. So maybe a tag that's associated with it, or an IP address, or an operating system type. And I might want to dynamically put that into its own dedicated EPG. That's much more advanced, and most customers don't actually want or require that functionality. What they think they need from microsegmentation is to say different groups of servers all sitting on the same subnet. And what does this really allow them to do? Well, historically, customers need to right size a subnet. So maybe they're going to put, I don't know, a /27 mask on their subnet. So they're trying to right size the subnet for the number of servers they're going to deploy. What we can do with ACI is that we can allow them to build bigger subnets. So maybe now I've got a /20 subnet, and I'm going to deploy lots of groups of servers in an automated way onto this network. So it's giving them a simpler network to build. I build one bigger subnet, and now I'm deploying lots of groups of servers securely onto that network, and I can now choose who can talk to who across that infrastructure. And really this is the first form of microsegmentation that I always look at with customers. And I think this is the one that generally they want to do. So let's look at this on a slide, and then we'll talk more about the attribute method of working as well. So we've just looked at different forms of microsegmentation, the first being segmentation within a subnet. And now we'll look in a bit more detail about attribute-based segmentation. So again, I'll start off and I'll build my VRF, my subnet, and here is my EPG. So this is known as a base EPG, and this is where my servers are attaching to on the network. And what happens is that APIC looks at the virtual machines that live inside this EPG, and it's going to dynamically move them to a new one. So if we have a new EPG created just here, what will happen is that I'm going to take a server that's attached to here, and based on an attribute that it's got, I'm going to move it into this EPG here. So it's now attached to this new micro-segmented EPG, Again, it could be based on a tag, it could be based on an IP address, an operating system type, etc. So this is great, and we can use this type of functionality. But I think more importantly, if we think of the operational impact that this means for a customer. You see, inside Virtual Center, what they would see is a port group based on this EPG. And the naming constructs of this would be based on the tenant. It would then be based on the app profile. And then it will be based on the EPG. So inside Virtual Center, they'll see that as a port group. But actually what's happened is we've moved dynamically devices into other EPGs, as you've seen here. So I might move this server out. If I have another server, I might build another one, maybe for Linux servers, for example, and I'll pull this machine out and move it to this one. But inside Virtual Center, the customer only sees the base EPG. So if this is the functionality that the customer wants, I personally wouldn't take this approach. Whilst it's valid and whilst we can certainly operate in this mode, the approach that I would take is to actually just build them 3 different port groups, all on the same subnet, and deploy my servers accordingly. So here's my second EPG, and here's my third EPG. So I always like to give the customers the choice. Operationally, what's the most easiest and what's the most simple for them to consume? And if they're troubleshooting on a Friday night at 3 in the morning, how do they want to troubleshoot the network? Do they want something that is nice and simple and is very clear for them to look at? Or do they want to have this attribute method where we can dynamically move things out into different EPGs? Both are completely valid, both are fully supported. So always take a step back and think to the customers, or explain to the customers, what's going to be best for you from an operational perspective. Because if this is the functionality they want, I would go with this, but you could still tie attribute-based EPGs to this. So for example, if I've got a number of servers attached to this EPG here, maybe what I want to do is I've identified that I've got an infection or a virus on a specific server just here. So I would build my attribute EPG, and based on the IP address of this server, I will move this dynamically into a different group and I'll move it off of the network. So I would typically position attribute methods as a way to perform security functions on the network if I've been compromised, if I've got a virus outbreak or something like that. So use it for specific purposes and really stick to this method where I will have, again, my tenant, my app, and 3 different EPGs, because that generally is easier for customers to visualize in Virtual Center and understand the connectivity that they have on the network.